everyone. Mary Beckett, born in Belfast in 1926, is a writer described by Brian Moore as an extraordinary miniaturist of ordinary lives. I first heard about her work when Carlo Gebler mentioned it in a very brief series by the Irish Times on neglected or underrated Irish women writers. Similarly to Moore, he describes Mary Beckett's writing as stories about women in Belfast which are all marvels, simple, pure, piercing and true. They are also, to which some take exception but not me, I love this about them, quietist. They are emphatically stories about ordinary people, their lives of quiet desperation and their hard-won but always understated victories. Rarely is so much done with so little. Carlo came across Mary Beckett's work when Mary Denver of the late Bookfinders Bookshop and Cafe recommended and sold him A Belfast Woman for 20 pence. And I think this is really interesting, the ways in which a writer survives, even when their books have fallen out of fashion. I always think that in cultures all over the world, the Japanese have their portable shrines, my Vietnamese friend leaves out plates of food for her ancestors, the Mexicans make altars for Day of the Dead, and it seems to me that as a writer, part of that same work is remembering and acknowledging and celebrating writers who've gone before, keeping that genealogy, that link with their wisdoms and achievements alive. One way that this is done brilliantly in recent years is by Turnpike Press, who've brought back into print works by Janet McNeill, by Ian Cochrane, by Brian Moore. I'm very hopeful that soon Mary Beckett will be on their slate as well. But it feels particularly important keeping a writer's wisdoms and writing and achievement alive and current and spoken about, particularly when that genealogy, in this case perhaps one of women's writing, falls somewhat outside the scope of the main canonical tradition. As soon as I read Mary Beckett's stories, I felt her so strongly as a literary forebear. Her two collections of stories, A Belfast Woman and A Literary Woman, comprise 11 and 10 stories respectively, many originally written for broadcast on radio, all narrated by or concerned with the lives of Belfast-born girls and women. It seemed astonishing to me that this psychic project was so akin to what I was doing in my collections of short stories, Multitudes and Intimacies, both of which have 11 stories, both of which are narrated by Belfast-born girls and women, and no one had said to me that I should read her. Another way that I think you'll see how much she fits into a genealogy of Belfast writing is the description of this sunset. See if this reminds you of anyone. Still, last November, a man came round here trying to sell Venetian blinds. Some of the houses have them, but I said no, I like to look out. I pointed to the sunset behind Divis, bits of red and yellow in the sky, and a sort of mist all down the mountain that made it nearly see-through. The man looked at it for a minute, then he said, "Do you know that Belfast has the most beautiful sunset in the whole world?" I said I didn't because I'd never been any other place to look at sunsets, and he said, "They tell me Belfast has the best, and do you know why? It's because of all the smoke and dirt and dust and pollution." And it seems to me, he said, it seems to me that if the dirt and dust and smoke and pollution of Belfast, just with the help of the sun, can make a sky like that, there's hope for all of us. So you read that and you think, whether or not Anna Burns knows that when she's writing her extraordinary Sunset and Milkman, there it is. It's a missing link. It's a missing link in the literary tradition that is really important to preserve and to keep alive. So it became something of a mission for me to talk about Mary Beckett and get more people reading her. A great writer, of course, isn't just relevant to other writers of their specific parish or of their more general island. One recent convert to her work is the English novelist Gwendoline Riley, who's also a fan of Chekhov. She heard me talking about Mary Beckett on the radio, bought all of Mary Beckett's work online for pence secondhand, as you still can, and she agrees with me in my assessment of Mary Beckett as a Chekhov of the North. But with me to make this bold claim today are two Belfast writers, Jan Carson and Riley Johnson, who are at different points in their writing journey. Jan, of course, has published several novels, translated into a dozen different European languages, shortlisted for prestigious competitions and winner of the EU Prize for Literature. Riley Johnson has just started to publish. I first came across Riley's work in the essay by edited by Paul McVeigh in the collection of 32, The Importance of Working Class Writing. Riley wrote a beautiful essay about playing the trombone and travelling to the School of Music and music and working class backgrounds. And Riley was also the second prize in the Martine Crawford Award last year. Riley also has really interesting geographical connections with Mary Beckett, so brings a really interesting perspective. So I'm going to ask both Jan and Riley in a minute how and where they first encountered Mary Beckett's work and why it was and is important to them. But for those of you who don't know her, I thought it might be useful to have a very brief biography and bibliography. So Mary Beckett was born in North Belfast in January 1926, the third of 4 children to Sean Beckett, who was a school principal, and his wife Catherine. The family were Catholic, middle class, and she was educated at St Columban's and St Dominic's before training to be a teacher herself at St Mary's. She taught at Holy Cross Primary in Ardoyne at a time when class sizes ranged from between 40 to 100 pupils per class. And she would come home and say that every single day would bring such energy, such a buzz of new ideas, such a rush of personality through the door that she went home and she had to start writing as a way of kind of all this stuff bubbling over. She taught there for 11 years before she married and moved to Dublin in 1956. She lost her first child, but she went on to have 4 children in 5 years and then a 5th several years later. She'd always written. She'd started writing and publishing when she was 23, a lot in the Bell magazine, and she'd had stories broadcast on the BBC and RTE before having children. But after moving to Dublin and beginning a family, she didn't write for 20 years. We're going to discuss this in a little bit of a minute, but she had this 20-year hiatus, and then in 1979, Sean McMahon, a publisher, Poolbeg, contacted legendary editor David Marcus, he of the Faber series of anthologies of Irish writing, to encourage her to start writing again and ask her, had she been writing, would she start again? A Belfast Woman, her first collection of stories, was published by Poolbeg the following year. Her first novel, Give Them Stones, by Bloomsbury in 1987. It won the Sunday Tribute Arts Award for Literature and was shortlisted for the Hughes Fiction Prize. And a couple of years later, 1990, she published a second collection, A Literary Woman. She also brought out 4 children's books, including Hannah or Pink Balloons, which won the Bisto Prize. And I particularly like these because they're called Orla at School, Orla was 6, and very handily, I happen to have a 5.5-year-old Orla. So I've been in the last couple of weeks, I've been testing these out to see how a 5.5-year-old responds to them. The verdict is good. So Mary Beckett died in 2013, just before Sinead Gleeson included her story Flags and Emblems in the anthology A Glass Shore. Anthologies, another really valuable way of keeping deceased writers' work alive and relevant in conversation with contemporary writers. We're going to discuss that as well. So it's a great pity that we didn't get to meet. Jan and I especially did lots of events around the publication of The Glass Shore, and it's lovely to think, it's bittersweet to think we almost could have been on a panel with Mary Beckett, but it wasn't to be. But Mary, here we are. We're going to delve into Mary's life and work in detail. And to begin, I want to put that question to you first, Jan. Where did you first come across Mary Beckett's work, and what does it mean to you as a writer, as a Belfast writer?
First of all, it's really lovely to be here. Second of all, I need to thank Lucy, because as with many writers, it was Lucy Caldwell banging on about Mary Beckett that first introduced me to her. And I think the first one that I read was A Belfast Woman, the short story collection. I guess what I'm really drawn to is, as Lucy's already mentioned, a lot of these particularly women writers from this neck of the woods have fallen out of print. And it is just, it was really eye-opening to get these glimpses into, mostly Mary's work focuses on the domestic sphere, but in a way that it's so universal and explores much, much bigger themes as well. And I find that fascinating. I also really love her dialogue. I think she had a wonderful ear for how people really talk. And that's something that I'm always intrigued by and trying to work out in my own work. I spend a lot of time in coffee shops earwigging on people just to get the kind of intonation right. And you know, she works her stories, some of them are set in the north and some of them are set in the south, and she manages to pick up on the slight differences in language across the border, which I find really interesting. And I also really love, she's mostly a realist writer. Most of her work that we'll discuss today is quite straight realist. There's a wonderful ghost story in one of her collections, which I really like. But I think what she does is she picks up sometimes on the absurdism of this place that is almost so strange. And you've mentioned Flags and Emblems, and that's a story that has a degree of absurdism in it. And I think in doing that, she highlights sometimes that, you know, the North is so complex, so possibly absurd, that sometimes it almost tips into a non-realist kind of version of what things are. And that, again, is something that I'm drawn to in my own work. So those themes, I think, bring me back to her. And also, she's just a bloody good writer. She's the kind of these are kind of books that you pick up and you've lost a night. And it's quite hard to put them down again afterwards.
Thank you. And Riley, I know that you read her because I told you to. But what did you first feel when you first read her stories?
The first I read as well, it was A Belfast Woman. And I think after the first two stories, and I thought, she's doing what I'm doing now. And I couldn't believe, like you said, that I hadn't heard of her before. And that's even more striking when we actually went to the same school. I went to St Dominic's as well, and I don't remember her being mentioned. She could have been, and maybe I was somewhere else. But when I started looking into her biography, and I felt that we had had very similar experiences, and what she writes about through the short stories in the novel as well are experiences that chime with me from what I've heard from my own family. I'll speak later on with Give Them Stones about like the falls curfew, but even the fact that she's a teacher as well, and that she felt that kind of immersion when she was teaching in Ardoyne. And again, that's myself as well. I teach in St Genevieve's up in Andersonstown, and it's the area that I'm from. My mother went to St Genevieve's, my dad, my mum are both from that immediate area. And that feeling of immersion, it actually gave me the confidence to write, and I came to writing very late. I think if I had have known about Mary Beckett sooner in my life, I would have been writing earlier, but I was mid-30s before I had the confidence to write about Belfast women. And like Lucy said, it just felt like there wasn't many of those stories out there, and certainly not working class stories. But reading her, I felt this sort of surge of confidence that what I was attempting to do was valid and that I should keep doing it. So I don't know if somebody can influence you if you haven't actually read them before you start writing, but if you know what I mean, she has influenced me from this point forward, certainly in my confidence and in what she's doing. So thank you, Lucy, for bringing my attention to Mary Beckett.
Important. Sarah Hall, the great English short story writer, she wrote a whole story called Mrs. Fox, based on a 1920s novel about a woman who transforms into a fox. And she said she never read it because she was scared it would be too similar to the story she wanted to write, but it was knowing that it was there that gave her the inspiration. Like so it is important, isn't it, that even knowing that someone is there, knowing that someone is on the periphery of your consciousness, of the world that you're absorbing, I think is important.
And has gone there before, and she also wasn't afraid. Like, she tackles some risky subject matter, and I have often questioned myself when I'm writing, you know, are people going to judge me for this, or are people going to accept this? But reading her work and knowing that she had done it, 50, 70 years before, I'm thinking, well, yeah, absolutely, I can do it now.
Yes.
So, yeah.
I'm just finding, Riley, as you're saying that, there isn't very much written about her. There aren't very many interviews with her, but there was a very good one that she did with Megan Sullivan for the Irish Literary Supplement in September '95, and she says Julia Whelan said on the radio that a writer can be a spy, so I thought, all right, I'm a spy. And she says, I listen to people on the radio tell their most intimate secrets, and I think they're mad. I, being a northerner, born and bred, think you keep things to yourself, you work things out yourself. I think people make themselves very vulnerable. I'm all for writing about it though, if it happened to someone else. So I love that sense of her, you know, finding a freedom in her fiction that she didn't feel in her life, or that she didn't feel in her close personal friendships, maybe.
Yeah, that's so true, because it's so exposing, talking about yourself and your own experience, especially I think in Northern Ireland as well, when it can trigger other people. but it's so much easier to hide behind a character and to give them those thoughts and characteristics, isn't it?
And I want to ask you, Riley, in both of the introductory quotes I gave by Brian Moore and by Carlo Gebler, she's described as a quietist, as a miniaturist. I can't help but think of the ways, you know, Jane Austen was told that she writes a little piece of ivory. And I think, as you've said, some of the subject matter is not at all quietist or miniaturist, is it? Would you tell us a little bit about some of the stories in Belfast Women that you found particularly striking or surprising or shocking?
I think what the sort of common theme that I find in this book, that it's women sort of dealing with the frustrations of their lack of control, isn't it, in life, and it's always as a result of men and maybe even sort of the society as well. But, you know, tackling those sort of themes of loneliness as well. And one of the stories, you know, she tackles sort of early pregnancy, you know, young pregnancy, unmarried. And I think towards the end as well. Yeah, so some of the themes of loneliness as well. Do you want me to talk a bit about Teresa?
Yeah, lovely. Let's hear a bit about, because Teresa is one of the most shocking stories.
Yeah, I would say so. It's a story where she, you know, it's post-war. I think just the year after the war has ended. And this young girl has a child who is black, but she admits in the story that the American soldier that she was with wasn't. But what I love about these stories is the sort of acceptance, and it's what I find chimes when I always reading these stories reminded me of my nanny, who I lost just before Christmas there, but she would have been maybe 10 years younger than Mary Beckett. But see this kind of matter of fact, the sort of acceptance of life and the things life throws at you. I find that in these stories with the women, you know, they're dealing with these terrible things sometimes, but they just go on and just, you know, it's very matter of fact. And what I love about Beckett's style is just, you mentioned Austen there, there's always that little subtle satire in the way that she tells the stories. We're she's sort of bringing it to the attention of the reader to sort of find a bit ridiculous, but the characters themselves just accept and move on. And another little comparison actually I found with Austen, and just this was in my head because I was teaching Sense and Sensibility last year at an A-level class, and they were just, you know, young people, they were reading the books and going, why are they all obsessed with marriage? And I was saying because marriage to them was freedom, because you could only have a house if you were married. So for young girls at the time in the 19th century, marriage meant freedom. It was getting a house and leaving your parents behind. And it's the same in these stories. These women were looking for freedom. They were looking to start their lives, and because I think it was only the mid-70s that the women could get mortgages.
Bar.
Yeah, equality. So a lot of these women, the only way they can get freedom is through marriage. And there's a lot of stories about houses and about getting houses and living in houses, being unsatisfied. Do you know, so houses just seems to be the theme. But in this story as well, Teresa, she has the baby and plans to go back to work the next day, you know, idealism. And then she finds this real longing. And what I love about the story is the arc. The opening line is just one of my favourite. During the last year of the war, Teresa was so recklessly gay that some of the neighbours began to whisper gossip about her. And I just love that line, recklessly gay. So, you know, but the arc then, once she has the child, she begins to worry. And again, we see those themes in stories as well as, you know, motherhood and how difficult it is and the worry that comes with that. She gives the child up to the nuns, and then she wants to bring the child, Deirdre, back. And her only way of doing that is to get married so that she can provide a home for Deirdre. And she does that, but the worry is sort of consistent through the rest of the story, just how that changed her, that experience, and how she carries the worry. And by contrast, the husband, like, he's this ridiculously like light-hearted, you know, finds so much humour in the situation, and he's, you know, in the background of the story constantly laughing away about the situation, and you can just feel her intense worry just, you know, carrying through. So yes, but even to sort of tackle those issues at the time certainly, as I said, gives me a lot of confidence, you know, going forward.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? These longings, these, you know, already we're kind of getting Chekhovian, people's lives unlived and the things that they carry with them. And I think she's very good on when people realise how unhappy they are, but even more moving when they realise how happy they could be, how close happiness, how close it just might be.
I think
Yeah.
that one is really honest as well, because I'm not a mother and I get fed up sometimes with women's writing banging on about motherhood all the time. And that story to me, it's not just worry. I think Therese is ashamed at places of having a child who sticks out so much and is different. And I don't think Mary Beckett's afraid to go there and say, like, a mother might not always have these, you know, expected maternal instincts towards her child. And it's okay to say, you know, I'm being honest here, I'd rather hide my child away in a convent with the nuns.
And she says it and give them stones as well. I think when Martha has her sons later in the book, and she talks very honestly about the difficulties of it. And as you say, like, you don't often hear that in fiction. I think there's
especially not in that era as well. It's becoming more of a thing to be quite honest about the experience of motherhood. But back then, I think that is a particularly shocking story in some ways. And it's the man who has the inherent maternal instincts in that story.
Yeah. He wants to, he's very keen on Deirdre and they have a close relationship, but I think her worry, and as you say, the shame, she's worried about what other people think more than anything, and that gets in her way,
Let's hear, Jan, let's hear a bit of some of her writing.
Oh, yeah.
I read that little paragraph in my introduction, but let's hear something a little bit more length.
I am going to read a couple of pages from Flags and Emblems, which is the story that Lucy had mentioned is in the Glass Shore anthology. It's a really short little story and I love it because it feels so contemporary. It could be lifted from East Belfast right now because we're still going on about flags and emblems X number of years later. The basic story is there's been some kind of a unionist parade in this town, this village, and there's a mixed marriage family, Fergus and Rachel. And Rachel's Protestant and Fergus is Catholic, and their child has picked up a little Union Jack flag, and being a child hasn't realised the meaning of it, and Rachel hasn't stopped him. That's the big thing. And the shame of this, that people have seen Fergus's child waving a Union Jack. What I also love about this is there's so much grace in this story. The passage I'm going to read begins with the kind of usual suspects giving off about the shame and the scandal, and then Fergus steps in with enormous amounts of grace, and I think again very countercultural possibly for the era that this was written in, this sense that actually these aren't big deals. The fact that your small child is waving a Union Jack isn't a deal breaker for a marriage or something that should bring shame in your family. So I think, again, this is quite a modern story, even though it was written a long time ago. No use indeed. The aunt shook her head. Poor Rachel. Fergus will never forgive her. He'd save her face outside, but you couldn't expect him to take kindly to her again. As well she has the child. Poor Fergus that was so busy every night with the Hibernian Hall and the Casement Commemoration Committee and all the rest of them, he'll have nothing now that his evenings with the men are taken away from him. But there's nothing we can do. We may go to our beds. It's dark night. It's not time. We'll go no earlier than usual. We'll see this day out if it has ruined us, the father ordered. This day, every day, what difference, the girl said bleakly. She left them and went upstairs to her room and opened her window. The distant lipping whisper on the sand and the sucking puffs of little breezes from the hill taunted her with their lack of violence. Isn't that a gorgeous sentence? She closed her eyes, and across the darkness came the staid line of wobbling foam rings that would never reach the open sea. The shots, she said to herself, remembering. The shots were only an echo. The fuss of the visit has happened before and will happen again, and it is so arranged that nothing happens at all. The only real thing today is between Fergus and Rachel. In his house in a new street at the edge of the town, where the builder's gear was not yet cleared away, her brother sat withdrawn, his mouth set thin. Rachel's hands were clenched together in her lap, while her mind scurried from the fear that his blankness between them would continue. Some neighbouring child had dropped the flag in the hall, and picking it up, a moment's blind anger against the affairs that kept Fergus from her made her push it into her son's hand and look back defiance at her husband's shock. It was when she saw Owen Devlin meet them that all her resentment died in sorrow at what she'd done. She realised that she had impaled him, not for one afternoon, but in a small town hoarding memories for the length of his life. He would suffer for his weakness, and she would suffer with him, and the knowledge that she shared his expiation would intensify it. She searched his face for some signs of forgiveness, unable to bear it that he should leave her now more alone than ever. "I'm sorry, Fergus," she said, the ache in her breast and her throat making her voice tremble. He half shrugged. "There's nothing to be sorry about," he said without lifting his head from the paper. Helpless, she would have offered 20 more years of her starvation to have undone the moment's revolt and left him undisturbed, occupied to his own satisfaction. She got up and laid her cheek against his arm, against the ridge under his coat where his shirt sleeve was rolled up in spite of her early insistence that he wear his cuffs neatly linked at the wrist. His body stiffened, but she said humbly, "I wish I hadn't done it." He drew her to him, and she pressed her head against his chest so that the badges in his lapel tangled in her hair, and the pen and pencils in his pocket dug hard against her forehead. "I'm very sorry, dear love," she repeated, and he said, "It doesn't matter," gently. He stroked her head as it leaned there, and swiftly the wealth that had almost disintegrated in despair through his neglect came to warm, stirring life in his arms. They strengthened around Rachel, and she lifted her face. "It doesn't matter at all, love," he murmured, and she watched his lips, neither aware what words had been spoken, only glad that their tone had been tender. A gust of strong wind round their house rattled their windows, unnoticed by them. Their love grew and engrossed them till they rested together in deep peace.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, it's gorgeous, isn't it? And everything that I think about her being Chekhovian, you know, the way that she writes is plain, sparse, vernacular, and then it opens up, doesn't it, into this tenderness, this longing, sometimes unexpected, you know, from the sort of hard, flinty descriptions of the scenes that have preceded. Her dialogue is very funny. It puts me in mind of Claire Keegan sometimes. If you ever hear Claire Keegan read, you know, the gossiping people and the dialect, and it's got that kind of energy. She herself said that she owed a great debt to Michael McClaverty. She wasn't a fan of Joyce. She didn't like Ulysses, but she acknowledged that Dubliners, when she'd been writing A Belfast Woman, Dubliners was important. What other writers would you think that she is like?
I see a lot of Bernie McGill's work in her short stories in particular, and I think one of the things you get a little bit in that passage as well is she writes very well about landscape. And, you know, because her books are called A Belfast Woman, and there's a tendency almost to focus on her as a city-urban writer, but a huge amount of her work is based in the countryside. And you saw in that little passage of the description of the beach, she writes beautifully about landscape and nature. And there's a gentleness to the way she does it, but also a power. And I always find that in Bernie's work.
That's lovely. Bernie's latest collection, This Train Is For, was published by No Alibis last year. And even just that title story, the train going through the landscape.
And Bernie's characters, similarly to Mary's characters, it almost feels like you get the weight of the generations that came before them with her characters. So there's often kind of referrals to like family and the weight of tradition and what's expected in families and aunts and uncles and things like that. And so I don't know if Bernie's actually read any of Mary Beckett, but I can definitely see that. And if you haven't read Bernie's work yet, you're in for a treat because it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, seconded. Riley, who would you characterise Mary Beckett's work as? I'm making the case for Chekhov, so as well as would you find her Chekhovian? I'm going to kick you off the panel if you say no.
Yes, absolutely. As you say, it's that kind of sparse text and the dialogue as well. And as I said, I love the matter of fact. You know, in the dialogue as well is the narrative. And I love as well you know, I think we have a tendency today in sort of modern fiction almost to sort of apologise for things, or to focus a lot on sentiment. And I find her work really unsentimental. You know, it's very direct. It's, you know, this is what's happened. And she doesn't project any of her sort of emotions onto the reader. It's written so well that you feel those emotions yourself, but you don't feel like it's been dictated to you. And I think that's just so clever. I mean, it would be something I would really hope to achieve in writing, is to get that reaction, but without, you know, making it over emotional. So I'll have to say yes to Chekhov, yes. And I just think I just find, as you say, with Bernie McGill, but I think now that I've read her, I do just see connections between Northern Irish writers, and I think we do seem to have a style, you know.
There's lots of Wendy in there as
yes,
well,
it's that again.
Erskine.
It's that
Yeah,
sparseness.
I think the dialogue and the sly observation.
Yeah,
I think definitely.
You invoking Venetian blinds very close to the start of the chat. I was like, oh, Wendy's all over Venetian blinds.
I think as well, this week, Jan, I know you were at the unveiling of the plaque for Brian Moore that's just gone up. And I see Brian Moore here as well, particularly in her second short story collection, A Literary Woman. You know, Brian Moore's Maiden Aunts, and Brian, would you like to introduce for us A Literary Woman, Miss Teeling,
yes,
the titular character?
We've all got different copies of these books, so it's hard to find which one you're after on the table. This is A Literary Woman, my Bloomsbury copy of it. A Literary Woman is really interesting because it kind of straddles that world between the novel and the short story collection. It's linked. So the link running through a lot of these stories is this idea of these poison pen letters which are being sent around in a local neighbourhood. So in a way it's almost a cul-de-sac novel. You're getting the same names and neighbours popping up over and over again. I also love a poison pen letter because I'm such a big Agatha Christie fan. So it is that if you like The Moving Finger, which is Marple at her best, this is probably your gateway drug to Mary Beckett. And there's also some really mean, vicious women in here as well, which I also really enjoy. Probably some shades of Muriel Spark in here, which I don't know is maybe the same era, crossover anyway. Those very caustic women that Muriel Spark writes really well, who are aware both of the how they're projecting themselves and their inner dialogue, and sometimes there's a tension between how they want people to see them and then what's going on inside. It also has begins with the ghost story, which I think is the only kind of supernatural element.
The first story is Judy and her long engagement.
Yeah. Oh, the long engagement.
Long engagement.
Dear
so
goodness.
Here, this makes me think of Brian Moore. Judy. Well, funnily, this week I was with some of my own writing students. We were looking at handling backstory, and one of the little examples that I used was from a story of Jan's, one of Jan's caravan stories, where there's a woman who could never marry because she was always looking after her mother. And she regrets this decision, even as she's trying to talk herself, she's trying to rationalise it to herself now that it's too late. And she's a type.
She's a real person. Yeah, I'm not going to tell her name or I'll get into big trouble, but it was the lady who used to drive me to Sunday school when I was wee, and she's engaged for 40 years to a man, and the problem was that both of them had an elderly mother at home, and neither of them would get married until the elderly mother died, and neither of them would see fit to move in with a mother. And lo and behold, his mother died and he married somebody else. So I think Mary Beckett had her finger on the pulse with the long engagement story here, and it's still, every time I read it, it makes me wince because there's a particular woman's face comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think the stories in A Literary Woman, they're a bit sharper, they're a bit nastier, maybe a bit more formally playful, and they do have, she starts playing a bit more, doesn't she, with form and with her theme of her poison pen letters, with her ghosts.
And I think I much prefer this collection to Belfast Women. I think stylistically she tightened up by this stage. Some of the stories in A Belfast Women are really good, but I would like to give them a hard edit kind of thing, whereas these, I think they're all really punchy. And I also think that some of the women in here feel like they've got a little bit more autonomy. If they're maybe not acting on it, but they are definitely audibly questioning the systems. There's a story in here about a woman going up to Belfast to see an old lover that she used to have who's been injured in the Troubles, and she's very, very self-aware, and it's nice to read that. It feels refreshing. So I'm much more drawn to the women in here probably than the other collection.
Funny, I prefer Belfast Women.
Really?
Yeah, for its sort of soulfulness. So yeah, honestly, there's something for everyone. Let's hear, Riley, would you introduce her novel, Give Them Stones?
Yep.
The title of this novel is taken from a 1933 American book set during the Depression by Nathaniel West, and it says, when they ask for bread, don't give them crackers as does the church, and don't, like the state, tell them to eat cake. Explain that man cannot live by bread alone and give them stones. So there's a playfulness going on here because Martha is, it tells Martha's story, doesn't it? And she's a baker. But
Yeah.
Riley, yeah, you introduced this book.
Yeah, so Martha's story, so from her youth. Covering the war, first of all, I felt sorry for her because she's the one who didn't get to go to the grammar school. And I think from that point in her life, it seems to be a series of those sort of disappointments throughout her life where she's never the one thought of and she doesn't get the opportunity. And she seems to live in the shadow of her sister, Mary Bridget, quite a lot. She seems to have the lovely, nice life. But it does her well. So she's sort of evacuated out to her aunts in the country. At that time, she learns the skill of baking bread that she brings back to Belfast, and like a lot of these stories, sees the necessity of having to marry. And the man she chooses because he has a great stove. And do you know, what other reason is there? And a house. And one of the things I love about this book is this house. Dermot, the husband, goes on about this house. You know, this house has been in my family for hundreds of years, which is impossible. But it's this kind of clinging to the house. You know, and for her, it's kind of, you know, the mother's still there and she's looking after the mother. But it is, as Jan was saying there, there's autonomy here because she has the skill of baking bread and then she uses that. And there's a moment at the end of the book where she says, if I wasn't a baker, I'd be nobody, something like that. And it just, if I am not...
Are you a Republican? And she says, I'm a baker.
Oh yeah, she's very Republican at the beginning. Yeah, she talks about the border being like a nail in your shoe. She knows it's there, but she's not comfortable with it. So yes, but she kind of changes her mind. The sequence I'd like to read from, if that's okay, is towards the end of the novel. So she establishes this bakery in Dermot's fabulous house with this great stove. But of course it's attacked several times. The army have come in. So it's set during the Falls Curfew, 1970. So she's selling bread to the neighbours. Of course the army come in and, you know, they sort of mess up her bakery. She gets it up and running again, but then Dermot loses his job and he's not too keen on having all of these women turning up at the house when he's sitting by the fire. So he takes his old bakery van and he converts it into a sort of separate bakery. So I imagine it's like, I was thinking like a van shop. If any of you were sort of from Belfast, there would have been the van shops, but still there's people, I've been in streets in Belfast when people have containers in their gardens and it's a wee sweet shop, you know. So it's funny that it's still going on, but I imagine it was that sort of setup, you know, the back of the van was the shop. So she has established, but of course the threat is still there. Dermot's paying the rent when everybody else is kind of on strike from paying the rent. She's threatened by the army, of course. But also she has these big sons and the IRA are after them for recruitment, so she's in a constant state of anxiety. But what I love about this passage here is that she's found music and she's found solace in music. So she goes to see Emer, her niece's choir, and she comes out, and I'll start from here, from where she arrives. She says, "There's music too," I said, not really meaning to say anything, but thinking of all the things in the world that I was missing. The next Saturday, Mary Bridget brought me a little Russian record player and Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony because I loved the country, she said. I couldn't understand where she got that strange notion, but I loved the music and I played it over and over and over again. Sometimes my customers would put their hands up over their ears in fun, pretending to be deafened, but I generally turned down the knob when somebody was at the door. She kept on buying me records until I had a stack of them. Mozart, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Handel and Schubert's songs. I asked Mary Bridget why those, and she just said she knew I'd like them. They lifted my spirits. I thought of all this lovely music surviving for years and years before these wee streets were built, and how it would still be around after we were long dead. That's the way I would calm myself when I'd hear of one atrocity or another. Until one day a crowd of young soldiers flung open the door in the middle of the 1812 overture and shot a rubber bullet at my record player, knocking it off the shelf, breaking it into smithereens and fusing the electricity. They ran off laughing. I nearly cried with rage. People came round and told me how lucky I was not to have them shoot at me like those poor women in Andersonstown who were blinded by them. All my lovely escape world disappeared, but nobody else had any escape, so why should I? Some women were on tranquilizers and they'd come in for their bread, hardly able to make the words come out of their mouths or count their money or decide what they needed. I don't know how they managed their houses. I think they just sat there. It was no wonder that their sons they were so worried about ran wild and got themselves into trouble. Mind you, it was hard staying out of trouble. The soldiers stopped men and boys every time they went in and out of their streets and asked their names and what they were doing and where they were going. They had lists of names they'd consulted and they arrested people. The crowd that broke my gramophone were a bad lot. They heard Declan stammer and he was never let pass without being asked his name and all about himself, and he'd stutter, "Did it Declan Hughes?" And they'd laugh and repeat it and shout after him. He'd come in white with mortification, knowing that when he went out the same thing would happen all over again. I always warned him not to get upset, not to answer back, but I began looking in papers to see if he could get a job in the south. I saw an advertisement for a lad wanted in a garage in Dublin and I showed it to him. "What would you think of a plan for that?" "How could I?" he said. "Sure, I live here. How could I work in Dublin?" "You could go live there if you got the job. You'd be away from these soldiers. There's nothing to stop them lifting you." "I'm not going to be driven out by them," he said, and Dermot, all alarmed, took that line too. "He's all right where he is, aren't you, Declan? Sure, you don't care about those so-and-sos. He's got a grand job and he's a great help to me about the place. What would I do if Declan left?" But he did apply for the job, and I put in a wee note to say he had never been in any trouble, but was being harassed by the soldiers, and I feared for him. He got the job, and the good, kind people took him into their house until he got a place in a flat sharing with a couple of other young lads. Patrick got a job too as a translator in Strasbourg. He did his degree in Queen's University, and nobody ever bothered him. He answered the soldiers, taking no real note. And he got his exams and his job and went off to translate German and French. Dermot hadn't talked to him much as he was growing up, but he wrung his hands when he left. "What will we do, Martha? What will we do without our sons to keep us company?" I was so sad too, but relieved they were gone from danger, and I told him he'd have plenty of trouble looking out for Owen and Eamon, who were left school and had no jobs and no streets safe for them between the soldiers arresting and the IRA recruiting.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Riley. Yeah, there's one of Mary Beckett's stories. She talks about the mother's daughter goes away to Canada, and she said she had a dream life there, perfect life, everything I've always wanted for her. It was just a pity she was so far away. Yeah. You know, the heartbreak there. Jan, what I found interesting when I read Give Them Stones is that there's so little written about the Blitz in fiction. Brian Moore's novel, Emperor of Ice Cream, but Give Them Stones has such an interesting section on the Blitz because Martha leaves the centre, leaves all the terraces that are being bombed, and she goes to stay with her aunts, her sort of maiden spinster aunts in the countryside. And funny, Riley should say, you know, how did she know that I like the country? Because Jan, you've already made this case for her as a writer of landscape in the country, and
Yeah.
that's one of the strongest parts of the book for you, isn't it?
Yeah, for me it was very recognisable for two reasons. My nana grew up on the Cliftonville Road and was evacuated out, so that story I've heard from her firsthand. But my granda grew up in a hachel, in a wee kind of house that became my great auntie Anna's house, which I remember as a child going to, and it's identical to the two spinsters' house that was it Bessie and Maggie are the two aunts that she goes to live with. And so much of this city girl's experience of going to stay in this wee cottage and having to learn things that are very different to her urban experience. There's a wonderful scene where she's making soda bread and she has to, in the end, get the aunts to measure it out in cups because they just do it by instinct. I should pinch of this and a bit of that, and she tries to copy it and it tastes like nothing. And that's what I remember my Auntie Anna and my Auntie Sadie being very like that. It was just all instinctual. And even just coming from the big metropolis of Ballymena to visit that for the day felt like you were going back in time. There's a gorgeous scene in Give Them Stones where the narrator gets a job as a cleaner for a school teacher, and she takes all of her furniture out into the front yard to clean it, and the school teacher comes home and she's mortified that everyone will have seen this. And that's incredibly familiar as well. I don't think we've mentioned her yet, but I think, I'm sure she hasn't read Mary Beckett, but to me there's a lot of Elizabeth Strout in here as well, like the focus on the small communities with everybody watching.
Yes.
And the gossip. And we had a wonderful book group yesterday about Anna Burns' Milkman. Milkman is also full of that world of women watching women and commentating
and
on them.
behaviour regulated by what others might think, and the poison pen letters and the sense of shame as a sort of societal force field.
And the kind of split between what's said and then what's said when no one's listening, which is usually the more interesting stuff, what's said behind people's backs. I think Mary Beckett's a master of that.
And the violence, it's interesting, Riley, she's writing, of the violence in the streets, and she's writing of the troubles, and she's writing, but in her short stories, there's an incredible amount of latent violence. Here's a couple of extracts. In her story Heaven, before the winter set in, she, the character Hilary, told the priest at her monthly confession, "I have feelings of hatred for my husband, murderous feelings. I'm afraid I will do him an injury. I've carving knives and heavy casseroles in the kitchen." And there's one of the most moving stories, very, very short story. It's called The Excursion. And Eleanor Teggart, there's an excursion to Dublin, and she's trying to build herself up to say to her husband, "Please, can I go?" And then he comes home and he says, "Have you heard about the excursion to Dublin?" And her heart leaps, and he says, "I think I might go on it." And she resigns herself to the fact that even if he goes in it, if she's careful and if she measures out her questions carefully, it might give them 4 or 5 days worth of things to say to each other because they don't talk to each other. And then when he comes back, 2 men carry him home, and it turns out that he's got off the train, gone into the pub a few metres away, and just got blind drunk all day. And for her, so they sort of deposit him in, and everything sort of boils up in her then, and again, this sort of Chekhovian sense of she's thinking what she would have done with that day and how that day would have fed her internal life and her imagination for decades to come. And then there's a sentence, he staggers in front of the fire and she shoves him, and she hopes in that moment that she'll shove him into the fire, but he catches hold of the mantelpiece, and then she sort of pretends to herself that she didn't mean it and she didn't do it. And so there's all of this violence there, isn't there, in the stories?
Tense up, and yes, it's just the injustice. They're also full of this injustice of women not getting to experience these things. But one of my favourite things about that story that I noticed in others as well is she admits openly that she married him for his money at the beginning because she thought that would bring her freedom. So there's this great irony in the fact that she married him for his money thinking it would bring her freedom, but it did the opposite. She can't even get a day trip to Dublin. There's a lovely quotation later on, I think in one of the other stories, where the character says that she married a man because she saw his sister's child in the pram and thought, you know, it was a bonny baby, so, you know, I'd be doing with that. And she was never too keen on the husband. But yes, it does seem to be, you know, all this pent up frustration that these women feel, and from time to time, you know, and I suppose it's that northern reticence as well. This northern, you know, we can never really communicate our feelings, and it's a really Northern Irish thing. We can't say how we feel, and these characters don't seem to ever explain how they feel, except there's one sudden infant death in A Literary Woman, where it feels like she's trying to communicate with her husband about her feelings, and it's clear that she's suffering a depression.
Is that the one where the baby drowns?
The baby drowns,
Yeah.
and he calls her mopey.
Yeah.
Mopey.
He's going to
And
leave because he's fed up
he's
coming
away,
home to a mopey woman
a
every
mopey
night.
woman. Yeah, and it just, blew my mind.
But do you not think it's balanced? Because I felt like there's all of this violence and this rage and these angry women, and then sometimes there's also this quite naive sense of, aren't people lovely? Like it was in that passage that you read, and the good, kind people in Dublin took him in.
Oh, yeah.
And the incredibly, almost kind of Call the Midwife level. I always think the nuns in Call the Midwife are very forward thinking for nuns.
Yeah.
But it's in that the Teresa story where the parish priest says, and all of you women who've had babies outside of marriage, you should go and raise them and bring them up and not be ashamed of them.
And if anyone says anything against them,
Yeah,
I'll have a
send
word.
them to
Yeah.
me. And I was like, oh, he should be
Surprised
in
me.
Call the Midwife.
It's I'm sure some of you have some questions that I'll come to in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you one more thing each, that in the interview, the biggest interview that Mary Beckett gave, she was asked, what does a woman need to write? And she says, as well as having time, you need a clear mind. The majority of women, if they're rearing a family, wouldn't have a free enough mind. And the interviewer says, so a woman needs £500 and a room of her own, quoting a famous Woolf essay. And Beckett disagrees, and Beckett says, no, she needs a room of her own. And she wouldn't get a room of her own until the children leave. And she says that's the thing that makes her particularly an Irish novelist, an Irish writer, she feels. That you don't get a room of your own until the children leave. And I wondered, you know, sort of a generation of writers on, I wanted to ask each of you, what do you feel that a writer needs to be able to write well today?
Proper funding.
I think the thing that has been the biggest shock to me is just how much plate spinning that you have to do. I don't have any children. I have a room of my own, but I seem to spend 90% of my time doing admin and other things to generate enough income to buy yourself about 90 minutes of writing every day. So I would be more of the, can I have the £500 rather than the room of your own?
Cafe and
Yeah, I'll sit in somebody else's room if I've got £500.
Riley?
Same. It's time. I mean, I have to work full time. I'm a teacher, and so I don't have the time to write. But even, I mean, I was amazed at Mary Beckett saying that when she worked in Holy Cross, that she would go home with all this energy to work with to write. I'm the opposite. I come home and I have no energy whatsoever to write, and it's not even physical. Well, it is physical energy, but it's actually mentally. I have nothing. I have no creativity because I've used it up during the day. So I feel I spend my life trying to snatch these school holidays, weekends, where I can be creative, and it's just it's that mental space in order to be creative. And it is because I have to work, so it comes back to finances again. So it's the space in your head to be creative, and I think modern life as well, as you were saying with the admin, everything seems to come with admin now. There's so much more to do than the job. So I think, that's the difficulty.
In all of the Potter biographies that you get at the end of books, and it says she stopped writing for 20 years to raise her family. And she did. She had 5 children and she raised them. And there are so many gorgeous scenes of family life in the novels where the woman is, the children are fighting and the baby needs fed, and so she's putting one child at the back on the trike and the other child into the garden and feeding the baby so that the husband can read the paper. There's all these sort of scenes of family life. But I wondered, Riley, I read that sentence, she stopped writing for 20 years to raise a family, and I always wonder, is it that simple? Is there more to it than that?
Yeah, well, I heard that she said that it was actually the detachment from Belfast. I mean, she was writing about Belfast and Belfast women, and then she moved to Dublin. And she said somewhere that that detachment, she felt, I think she said she felt she couldn't write about Dublin women, but I wonder why she couldn't write about Belfast women still. And I wonder, did she feel that she wasn't qualified anymore? I feel, I said earlier, now that I'm working in the area that I'm from, I feel more immersed, I feel more qualified. But I also think sometimes a bit of distance is quite useful to take you away from it. But I also, like Jan, I don't have children, so I don't know. I deal with children all day long, other people's, but I can't imagine what it's like having your own children and trying to find that space when you don't have the constructed hours during the day where you only have to face them. So I don't know, Lucy, what do you think? Do you think having children makes it sort of difficult to get down?
Do you know what they know and they resent when you have an imaginary world that you're immersed in that they're not part of? They can sense it. And so they, quite often I'll end up trying to, I know that if I stop, I'll lose the frequency of what I'm thinking or writing, and they'll kind of creep closer and closer, and they'll end up in a den under my desk, while I try to finish the thing that it is I'm working.
Just hiding from them?
Yeah, just. But I think I'm sure some of you might have some questions. On Mary. I should say as well, Mary Beckett's novels for children, these obviously come from having children, and her books for children are delightful. They're really lovely. Do we have anyone from Mary Beckett's family here?
No, I'm her son.
You're her son. Wonderful, lovely to have you here. Thank you for coming along. Can I ask, as we have you here, I would love to ask, we've been discussing your mother. What are your do you have any concept of your mother as a writer when you were growing up? When did you first become aware of your mother as a writer?
We knew she had written short stories. We knew that because she had a desk where she kept all her work and her short stories and copies of the Bell and all of that. She had a desk and there were drawers full of them. So I anyway would open them and go through them and read them. But maybe not talk about them, but we did know them. And then she wrote, and then there was that 20 years where she was our mother, not a writer, and she wrote again then from 1979. But we didn't really, she told us she had won a prize for the excursion. And at one point when I think we must have been annoying her, or I was annoying her, or something about it, she did say that she would have been able to write much more if she hadn't had you lot. But that was only at a particular moment of irritation, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel, even I was raised, not consciously, but I very much thought that I feared the pram in the hallway being the enemy of art. And it was my experience, my kind of delightful experience, because I've had friends who it's gone completely the other way, but that having children it broke open my creativity. I feel that I started writing in my own voice when I had children. I had far less time. My time mattered more. I had interesting material. I didn't care what people thought so much. So I found that actually for me, motherhood was when I started writing and publishing my short stories. And I feel that children, despite what your mother may have snapped in moments of irritation, I'm sure I've been there too.
Do you know what? And I'm going to kind of quote yourself back at you. One of the things I've learned from you over the years, Lucy, is that writing doesn't always happen when you're actually writing. So much of writing happens in the thinking time, the downtime, the gathering material time. And so I would probably argue that, maybe Mary Beckett wasn't sitting at her typewriter for those 20 years, but she was still writing.
Yeah. Beautiful,
Well, and
really.
she didn't write at her typewriter. I think she would go up to her room, to her bedroom, and close the door and just go in and write on sheets of paper.
With a pen?
Yeah, with a pen. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. What does it feel like for you reading her stories now?
Well, I just think they're very good stories, very, very well crafted, and to turn it round, I've just read your book on the Blitz, and there are similarities, I think, in the way your sentences work and all hold together so beautifully.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I thought it'd be really nice to finish this event, and you're going nowhere. I want to talk to you afterwards. But I thought it'd be lovely to finish this. I thought it'd be lovely to finish this event with some of Mary's own words. So here we get. This is a passage from the very end of Give Them Stones that has. This to me is pure Belfast. It's funny, it's soulful, it's got that gorgeous soulful sweep. So this is Martha towards the very end, when she's worried of the IRA, she's worried of the army, she's worried for her sons. And she says, sometimes when I was awake at night, I'd think maybe they'd shoot me and that I'd die. I'd have to hold up my face out of the bedclothes to take a deep breath then, because while I wasn't afraid of the next world or of leaving this one behind, I didn't look forward to the act of dying. I wasn't afraid of having babies, I thought to myself. I wasn't a bit nervous. I made no fuss. I wasn't afraid. Then it occurred to me that it wasn't the same. I couldn't know, were the babies frightened? That was the parallel. They left their warm, dark womb along a narrow passage with the danger of getting stuck and wanting oxygen. Was the world they fought their way into a wonderful place? It was light. There was that. In the next world would be perpetual light. When I was a wee girl, I couldn't say the word. Let perpetual light shine upon them. That was the prayer. May they rest in peace. Amen. We always said that about the dead. The Sabbath peace of the people of God, one of the priests used to talk about. And it sounded lovely, but it was a light I yearned for. I had a kind of recollection of wakening up once and opening my eyes into such strong sunlight that I had to close them again, and I let myself fall back to sleep in the sweetest contentment I've ever known. The strange thing is, I can't think how or when it happened to me, because no house where I'd ever slept let in that kind of morning sun. The Belfast streets were too narrow and too shaded, and in the country the old aunt's house had little small windows you couldn't even see out of without bending down. So I've often thought that was my foretaste of heaven. "Och, sure, we'll be happy in heaven," I said one day in the shop, because the women were telling of their troubles, all bowed down. And one of them said, earnestly enough, "Do you think, will we? Will we be happy in heaven? I often wonder, because I wouldn't feel at all at home if I was happy." And she gave a cackle of laugh and gathered up her bread and went on her way. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you all so much for coming here. And Jan and Riley, thank you so much. Jan and Riley and I have been rereading all of Mary Beckett's work and discussing it, and talking about how best to discuss her and bring her to new audiences. So I'm very grateful for all the work and thought that you've both put in as well. Thank you.